Hello and welcome to our 6th annual Judith Neilson lecture, which is part of the school's prestigious UTZON lecture series, launched in 2010 to celebrate the renowned Danish architect Jørn Utzon. My name is David Sanderson and I'm the inaugural Judith Neilson Chair in Architecture in the School of the Built Environment here at UNSW. Before we begin, I'd like to acknowledge the unceded lands of the Gadigal and Bejigal people on whose land I'm currently on. I pay my respects to elders past, present and future who hold the memories, traditions, culture and hopes of Indigenous Australia, and also for all of us. This year's speaker, Baye Adofo-Wilson, who I'll introduce in a moment, follows on from a rich series of speakers, each of whom have talked engagingly about the built environment and societal challenges, whether it's corruption and its impact on poorer people, as Professor George Afori did last year, or how to build resilience into disaster recovery, as Dame Jo De Silva did in 2018. So to this year's speaker, who will be at least as engaging as all the other ones we've had, for sure. Baye Adofo-Wilson is joining us from New Jersey in the USA. Baye is CEO of BAW Development, and is a former deputy mayor and director of economic and housing development in Newark, New Jersey, of course, in the USA. Baye is a real estate developer, lawyer, and consultant with an expertise in arts and cultural districts and affordable and mixed income housing developments. Between 2014 to 15, Baye was an urban design critic at Harvard University's Graduate School of Design. And before that was a member of the Loeb Fellows class, also at Harvard. Before that, Baye co-founded the Lincoln Park Coast Cultural District, a non-for-profit organization redeveloping the Lincoln Park neighborhood in the city of Newark. Baye has always been a longtime activist for Black rights and is a decorated US Army veteran. Baye, it's an utter privilege to have you join us for this lecture. Baye's lecture is entitled Redeveloping Black Communities, Learnings from American Urban Planning. Baye, over to you.
Well, thank you. Thanks a lot for inviting me to this presentation. I am very thankful and honored to be providing this Judith Neilson UTZON lecture. Unfortunately, I'm not there in person, but definitely there in spirit and gratitude. I would first like to thank my friend and colleague, David Sanderson, for extending the invitation, as well as my colleague and classmate, Helen Lockett, for her insight, vision, and leadership. This is a real pleasure. On February 23rd, 2020, Ahmaud Arbery, a Black 25-year-old American football player, was murdered in Brunswick, Georgia, while running down the street. 3 white American men who murdered him called the police and said, "There's a Black man running down the street." The murderers felt that Arbery should not have been running down their streets in a white community. So they chased him, cornered him with their truck, and killed him. I have entitled this presentation, Redeveloping Black Communities, because unfortunately, in all the Black communities I've ever been in the United States, they needed substantial or sustained economic, physical, or social redevelopment activities. They needed robust and improved infrastructure. They needed more places to play. And the trauma of living in places without these resources and trying to seek them outside the community can be exacerbating and even deadly. Thus, this presentation builds on my 25 years experience as a real estate developer, as a government official, as a urban planner, as a policy advocate, and as a nonprofit executive. I first want to tackle the question of what a Black community is, because even though I'm speaking to an Australian audience, I think that there are some similarities to how Black communities are defined in the United States, or more specifically, how demographically minority, ethnic, or racial communities are defined treated, planned, and managed within a larger society that has a history of state-sanctioned violent discrimination. I think Black communities are not defined by simply the percentage of Black people in a particular zip code or a census tract or neighborhood or even a city, even though I think the number of Black people in those particular communities are important and essential to the ideas of what it means, what a Black community means. But I think before a community gets to the point of quantifying what a Black community is, there's something else that's triggering the public and private response to that. And I think that Black communities I think that what's triggering it is that it's just the presence, it's the notable, and consistent physical presence of Black bodies in a geographical area on a daily basis, living in all that entails, that defines a Black community. And that could be in the morning, it could be at night, it could be on the weekends, it could be people walking, talking, hanging out. It could be people going in and out of their out of their homes. But it's really the physical presence in the public space on a daily basis that is triggering a response from the public and the private sector. Now, these geographical spaces don't have to be in urban areas. They can be in rural areas. They can be on dead-end roads. It can be in the American South, in the urban North. It could be in suburban communities. But what it is the presence of people doing the things that you do when you live in a community. And it's the relaxation and ownership of that's really triggering the public sector's response and the private sector's response. And that has to do with everything from policing and education to retail and housing. In contrast, though, this is not just that communities of, it's not just sort of working class, poor communities. It could be all types of Black communities, whether they're middle income or higher income. It could be all types. But it's really their physical presence in the community that's really giving a response. And that response from the public sector, that response from the private sector really hinders or really is challenging for the larger society. And in that regard, I think the thing that is really important is that when Black people go out of those communities, that's when they're oftentimes bullied or harassed or marginalized or threatened or murdered. And so part of what I've been trying to do and work on is how do you redevelop spaces where everyone feels welcomed and there's opportunity and access for everyone. I was born in New York, but I grew up in a town called Paterson, New Jersey. It's a small city, about 160,000 people, 15 miles west of New York City. The city today is 90% Black and brown. I moved there when I was 12 years old, and I was there until I graduated from high school. Right after we moved there, the very first significant snowstorm, a friend of mine, my new friend, asked me if I was interested in shoveling snow. I said yes. He said, okay, let's go. And he said yes. I said yes. And so he said, let's go to another neighborhood. So about 3 blocks from where we lived at is a community named Radburn. Radburn is the community 3 blocks away. So we walked over from our neighborhood to Radburn to shovel snow. Now, Radburn is on the other side of the Passaic River. It's a city that has a lot of history. It was built in 1929. The architects were Charles Stein and Henry Wright. Radburn is a part of a town called Fairmont, and it was very central in the United States to the Garden City movement. It's a national historic landmark. The reason why it was important is because it was really the first place in the United States that had super blocks, really separation of people and cars, cul-de-sacs. And it's a community where you could live and work in the same community, which really wasn't a part of the sort of United States ethos. The first day we went shoveling, we made $30. But after that, every time it snowed, me and all my friends would walk across the 33rd Street Bridge into Radburn, which was 3 blocks away, just to shovel snow. On one of these trips, we noticed that there was a basketball court. And so, but our basketball court that was closest to our house had broken. The rim was broken. So we started going over there to play basketball. And maybe about 6 months or a year after us going over there to play basketball, the police came by and said that you guys can't play here. And we said, why? And they said, well, because you don't live here. And so unbeknownst to us, we didn't know that Radburn had this informal covenant where they didn't allow Black people and or Jewish people to live in the community. And that informal covenant lasted until the early 90s. So the police escorted us out of town and told us we couldn't come back, and said if we came back to the community that they would arrest us. So we went to Burger King, we played video games, and sure enough, we said, all right, let's go home. We walked by the bridge to go back home, and sure enough, the police was at the bridge guarding the entrance to the town. That summer, the municipality destroyed the basketball court rather than having us Black kids from Patterson playing in their courts. In the United States, we can all point to geographical areas which include the Black section of town or in a space that's predominantly white. You'll see that it's really the physical, visible presence of Black bodies that are really dictating it. Now, there's a lot of reasons for that. That goes back to slavery, the Underground Railroad, sharecropping, Jim Crow, redlining, integration, white flight, urban poverty and abandonment, disinvestment, and gentrification. The challenge really is that the majority of Black people in the United States, the real challenge is, right, where are Black people still permitted, guided toward, can afford, allowed to, or want to live? Because it's really, in most of those places, there's oftentimes a lack of physical and economic resources and infrastructure. And us, we as administrators, policymakers, urban designers, planners, and architects, we must assess what are the current and historical problems in those communities and craft redevelopment projects in hopes of fixing what's happening in those communities. Or I think the other answer is, how do we design and develop good projects that are accessible to people who have historically and presently been discriminated against because they are visibly, racially, or ethnically different? And one of the challenges is that oftentimes the model is a gentrification model. And what we really want to do is move away from that. What we want to do is move away to a point where people in the community can benefit from the economic redevelopment activities that happen in the community, and they can benefit from them now. So 25 years ago, I graduated from law school. One of my first jobs out of school was at a place called the Regional Plan Association. It's the oldest regional plan association in the United States. It was founded by Robert Moses, and it's a regional planning organization where it's New York, New Jersey, and Connecticut. So it's a tri-state regional. It's a tri-state redevelopment planning organization, and it's really one of the leading advocacy organizations in the country. Preeminent, strong, and I was hired 20 some years ago to be the New Jersey director. I worked on environmental issues, state planning issues, urban design issues, and open space issues, and throughout New Jersey. At the time, RPA was really concerned about the third regional plan. And what they wanted to do was to ensure that the New York City metropolitan region was competitive with cities like Tokyo and London and Mexico City and Paris. And so New Jersey, as well as Connecticut, had these nodes that were key to enhancing. And one of the big things about New York City is this sort of cultural infrastructure. And so the plan looked to the whole New York City metropolitan region to see which other cities had strong cultural infrastructures, and Newark had one. So me, I'm from, I was the New Jersey director, so I sort of jumped right in. I jumped in and started working to help the city of Newark develop a cultural plan. One of the places that they felt could help in developing this cultural plan is a facility called Newark Symphony Hall. Newark Symphony Hall was built in 1925. Has a 2,800 seat venue, almost 100 years old, and it's really the center of sort of jazz and culture in Newark at that time. So it was important, people like Diana Washington, Sarah Vaughan, the Rolling Stones, they all performed at Newark Symphony Hall. So if Newark Symphony Hall and other cultural venues in Newark can help the greater New York metropolitan area, it would make the city more competitive globally. But the challenge is that Newark was also 85% Black and brown. And so for a lot of people, they didn't want to come to the city. And so what RPA did and what I was working on was developing a plan. So the two things we did, we took Newark Symphony Hall, this cultural facility, and then we took another place, Lincoln Park. Lincoln Park is a 3-acre park across the street from Newark Symphony Hall. And we came up with a plan. And in that plan was to have outdoor concerts at Lincoln Park, to activate and renovate Newark Symphony Hall, but to create an arts and cultural district in Newark that really enhanced all the cultural activities, all the cultural venues there. We worked on the plan, we finished the plan, and then, the challenge I had was, when I was at RPA, I noticed that all of the plans, all of the projects, all the plans were just dusty plans on shelves in the libraries when the offices had libraries, and none of them were ever implemented. And I didn't want to be a part of that. So what I did was I spun off the Lincoln Park Coast Culture District to an organization. I became the nonprofit leader. So I go from being a policy advocate to a leader. But what I do learn at RPA is that you have to come up with a comprehensive plan, that you have to take into consideration all of the issues that are in the community. You have to connect the community to the regional, state, and national economies. You have to lay the plan that has implementation steps. You have to come up with something that's comprehensive, that's really based in the community, and the community needs to participate in it. When I started Lincoln Park Coast Culture District, one of the things that we did very early on, we continued on with RPA, is that we had monthly meetings, the second Tuesday of the month. And we did it for 6 years. For the first 4 years, we didn't miss a meeting. We had every Tuesday of the month, most of the time, 50 people would show up to the meeting. And it would be day or night, depending on the issue. But we really had these community meetings where we haggled out issues. And in those participatory planning meetings, most of the good ideas came up. We stopped having the meetings, however, because one of the board members or the organizations, we stopped having it because what would happen was that private real estate developers would come in and listen to our meetings. And then they would either go to the municipality or they would go to the private owner and try to beat a project that we talked about in the neighborhood meeting. They would try to stop that and then go ahead and try to implement that project. So in our minds, we said, well, we can't continue to do this. So we started having more private meetings. The other thing that happened was one of the board members partnered with the real estate developers, mostly because he had got tired of waiting. What ends up happening in a lot of the communities that we have all these plans and projects, but they never get implemented. And he complained about all the times his car had gotten broken into or how many times he got mugged. And he had the opportunity to make money with them. And so he left. But we finished the plan, and that neighborhood plan became a redevelopment plan, and we got the city of Newark to adopt the redevelopment plan. And we actually got a chance to implement it. We built about 100 units of housing. We had a urban farm where we had a CSA, and we were doing urban ag. We had a green job training program, and we also had a music festival. It was a multi-genre music festival, and about 50,000 people would come out. It was a gospel, hip hop, house, and R&B music festival. And over a 3-day weekend, 50,000 people would come out, and people were just dancing in Lincoln Park, which is really one of the goals of the plan. I did that for 9 years, and really by that time I was burnt out. So that's when I met David and Helen. I applied for the Loeb Fellowship, and went to Harvard. I got sick the first week and slept for 3 weeks, and then was there. But I decided when I was leaving that I was really just ready to jump back in. So what I did was a friend of mine who became the mayor, and he invited me to be the deputy mayor in Newark, and I began to run the Economic and Housing Development Department. Running an Economic Housing Development Department was a real challenge. Like, it was a real different position for me. And one of the things that happened really early on was just realizing how disproportional everything was. And it really reminded me of what happened this past year. And one of the things that happened this past year was the assassination of George Floyd. The police killed George Floyd. This is a sort of image of the police killing George Floyd. But when I was a deputy mayor in Newark, there are 9 departments in municipal government: planning, law, police, fire, public works, health and human services, finance, engineering, and a couple other ones. To my surprise, economic development was actually the smallest one. The police department was the largest department, and the police department's budget was 7 times larger than the economic development department budget. So when George Floyd got murdered, a friend of mine who's a well-known television personality was upset because Black activists from around the U.S. started calling for, started a movement to defund the police. And the first thing he said was, the right-wing media as well as the liberals are going to use this call to defund the police against the people who need police accountability. And the activists were concerned in saying that the police needed to be defunded. My experience was very clear that the police budget was the largest budget. It was 7 times larger than mine just as a budget, but it's also the police overtime budget for 3 months was larger than my entire budget. So in all actuality, their budget was 11 times larger than my actual budget. And I felt the responsibility of the whole economy. And Newark, New Jersey is the largest city in New Jersey, and it's one of the largest, one of the largest cities, not the largest city in the United States, but one of the largest ones with a large Black population in the United States. So it has about 300,000 people, and so I felt really responsible for it, but it felt like I had such a little budget to work with. So what I did was I did what planners do. I called my friends up. I started working with. I called the GSD up. I started working with public-private partnerships. I started funding organizations directly. I did everything I could to really create a level of momentum and excitement about what was happening in Newark, and we really changed it. When we got there, it was a $63 million budget, a $93 million budget deficit. When I left, it was a $16 million budget surplus. We had a huge amount of growth with billions and billions of dollars of activity while I was there. but it was really something I had to be resourceful from. And it was a challenge for me because we had all of, I saw how much the police were getting, and I saw how, in relation to the economic housing development. And was really, when people say you should defund the police, and I believe that the police budget needs to be adjusted, because I think that a lot of the challenges that a municipality is dealing with, if there's a more equitable distribution of resources, departments like public health or economic and housing development or neighborhood services could carry some of those loads. As I said, their budget was, in all honesty, 11 times bigger than mine. And I'm including all the grants and everything I gave. I'm not just the staffing. And so, and I literally had to partner with everyone to make sure that things worked. And it was always on a shoestring. So, when people in the United States talk about defunding the police and there's concerns, there needs to be a way in all places. How do you balance the economic justice issues with the policing issues and really come up with a budget that works for everyone? Because at this point, it's really not. And the disparities you see in communities, we will continue to see unless there's a balancing of the budgets. I did that for 3.5 years, and thereafter I decided that I was not going to do any development. A friend of mine asked me if I was interested in, a friend of mine who's also a state assemblywoman asked me if I was interested in doing any economic development work at home back in Paterson. And I hadn't really thought about it, to be honest. I had left Paterson when I left high school, but I was intrigued with the idea. So she proceeded to give me really the most complicated project in Paterson, the preservation and restoration of Hitchcock Stadium. Hitchcock Stadium was built in 1932. It was an old WPA project. It was built in the United States during the Depression, and it was built using union labor, a depression. It was a municipally owned facility. Very early on in 1933, they started letting Black baseball teams play there. So the equivalent of the Negro League World Series was played there in 1933. Teams like the New York Black Yankees and New York Cubans called it home, and even the New York Eagles called it home as well. There are 20 Major League Baseball Hall of Fame players that played at this facility. And there's only 2 or 3 stadiums in the United States where Negro League teams played. But the Hitchcock Stadium sort of mirrors what happened in the United States. It was a space where Black people played at. But when suburbanization happened, the stadium went from being city-owned to school district-owned. In the 1990s, the state took over the school district, concerned about the budget. And then 6 years later, 1997, the Hitchcock Stadium closed because the state budget, they didn't prioritize it. And so they decided to close it. It cost $4 million to fix the stadium and $4.8 million to demolish it, and they didn't either. So for the last 25 years almost, the facility has been vacant. So I pulled together a team like 2 years ago, and we came up with a restoration strategy. We're redoing the stadium. We're building a restaurant exhibition space dedicated to the Negro League. We're building 75 units of housing, and the total budget of the project is $100 million. Goldman Sachs is in it, and U.S. Bank, and these are big U.S. institutions, or global institutions. And it's been a good project. We started construction about 6 months ago. This is the view. This is from the stadium. It's the highest point in Paterson. You have views of Manhattan from this site. This is the stadium, and this is the housing construction area. This project has been interesting in the sense that what I've learned is that you really have to figure out how to preserve Black history. It's kind of a challenge because a lot of the facilities that were built for or by Black people, for Black people, were built inexpensively because the resources didn't exist. And so a lot of those structures have not made it. So you don't have the built environment, those structures to tell the history of what happens. The other challenge in the United States has been that there's just a level of resiliency around racial discrimination. And so whether that's what's happening now or what's happened in the 60s or what's happened in the 1920s during Jim Crow or during the Trump era, there's just a level of resiliency that keeps popping up with each generation. So each generation is challenged to find a new way to deal with racial discrimination in the United States. So preserving these historical structures that tell these stories are important. What I think sort of I like the most though is that, I get a chance to come home, a place that I haven't lived in 25 years or 35 years almost, and work. It's been a real pleasure to be with people that I've known for a long time and really take the experiences that I have over the last few decades as an urban planner and bring them home. That's it. I'd like to thank David again for the opportunity, and I appreciate the time. Thank you.
Baye, that was so extraordinary, so powerful. I'm sure everybody listening to that is moved. It's powerful. It's visceral. You present moving stories of the realities for Black people living in urban America, not from the past, but from right now with your opening story and your stories from the last 25 years. I sit here rather moved and rather humbled. The police budget is 7 times the economic development budget speaks volumes. But then you don't just leave it there. You don't just say, here it is. Actually, as an urban expert, a practitioner working for a quarter of a century in this, you then pull out lessons on how space is defined, how it's used, how it's perceived by others, how it's controlled by one group, white people, I'm assuming to the detriment of others, and all that follows from that. But you've been active. Baye, you've lived so many lives as a soldier, a lawyer, a politician, an activist, a teacher, a developer, and then as a father and others, which are so many lives. But I just want to ask you this one question. It's rather a direct question, but how much does your reality as a Black African man inform and drive your work? Is it tenacity, anger, patience, impatience, all of the above, none of the above?
That's an interesting question. How much of my being, so I don't know any other, I haven't had any other existence. So I think that's part of it. Some of it's experience. I was, very early on, I went in the Army and I was 17 years old. And so, one of the things about going in the military and, defending this country is that you're exposed to a lot of things early on. So a lot of my challenges came when I came home. I mean, I started off with the Vadburn discussion as a child, but when I came home, I had similar challenges as well. So some of it is a level of frustration, really, of having, given or sacrificed or defended a country that then you sort of come back to that you're getting discriminated against on a daily, weekly, monthly basis. That's part of it. But the historical context is important as well in terms of the persistency of it. It's just a persistent level. And to see what's happening now is, it's scary, really, really. It's scary, it's challenging, because as someone who is, 53 years old, I think of it as a context of how long I've been sort of working in the field, the amount of experience I have, and then the notion that at this point, we're still having the same struggles that we had before.
But I've known you for a number of years. You're calm, you're measured, you're collected. I think I would be angry, resentful. I would be everything of those. How do you manage that?
I don't think I'm calm, or I don't think I'm any of that. I don't think that I'm that calm. So I think that you may have not seen that person. I don't think there's a whole bunch of people might not say that. So I think that I sort of grew up in this environment. So one thing you do learn, I guess, when you get older, is that it's protracted. and you have to you do have to have balance. So I do yoga, I meditate, and I do all the things that sort of help me from being angry. But I also think that you have to have a level of determination, that to work on it. My grandparents, both of my grandparents on my mother's side and my father's side, were sharecroppers, and my mother didn't graduate from high school. So so I think about it in relation to them that, when I was growing up, all my grandparents were alive, and I got a chance to hang out with them. And literally, they sharecropped into the 1960s. And so in a span of 50 plus years, there's been a lot of advancement, at least in terms of our individual families. So I'm thankful for that component of it and the work that took to it. But yeah, I'm probably angry most days.
Oh, well, and then just moving on therefore to your professional work. I mean, having, as a deputy mayor, but also a tutor at the Graduate School of Design, for goodness sake, at Harvard, to being a developer, to being a lawyer, all these things. What are the strategies you employ in order to achieve what you want to get? I mean, it strikes me it's around urban and betterment, especially for Black people in urban America. How do you go about doing those things? What tools do you use?
Well, I went to the experience in Redmond was very important to me because I went into the field. I went into the urban planning field. I have a master's of city and regional planning, and I sort of grew up in an environment where the Garden City movement, Radburn was really 3 blocks away from my house. So a pillar of the Garden City movement, sort of the prototype of the Garden City movement in the United States, was really the first time I faced sort of persistent and consistent racism. And it was a part of the urban planning field. And in Patterson is the first planned industrial city in the United States. The Falls, which I didn't really talk about earlier, but the Falls is a 77-foot falls. It's the second largest falls east of Niagara in the United States. And the city is built up around it. Alexander Hamilton, who is I don't know if you've seen the play, The Hamilton, but it sort of founded Patterson in the sense of it, planned Patterson as an industrial city. It was already indigenous people here, but I founded Patterson as a manufacturing city because they felt like the United States needed to be a manufacturing country because at the time they were getting all their manufactured goods from England. So I grew up in an area, in a city, in a community where there was 2 very stark historical urban planning stories. The story of Patterson as the first planned industrial city, and then the story of Radburn as really the United States' first garden city community. So I think from that I learned a lot and was exposed to a lot. And so when I went to graduate school, I just was really wanting to learn. When I went to school to work to help my community, I had that notion when I went to graduate school. So I just continued on. And what was been helpful was actually having a law degree because it's given me the capacity to pivot and do different things that I want to do and to develop the skill sets necessary to be able to do it.
So you find planning and law together actually are more than the sum of the parts?
Yes, definitely.
Yeah, I'm sure that's true. In Australia, we have no shortage of discrimination against First Nations Aboriginal people who are regularly excluded from planning processes, almost any process of governance at a wider scale. And you mentioned gentrification, and in the big cities here, we're finding gentrification, the prices are going up, and Aboriginal people are being pushed out of traditional areas, such as in Redfern, in Sydney, and elsewhere. And I'm just curious, from your experiences from elsewhere, do you think there's anything you can share from your experiences that might be applicable here?
Well, that's happening, and that's one of the challenges in the United States. And not that it's just gentrification; it's also where people are being pushed to. So the Aubrey story is important because Brunswick. He lives in Brunswick. He too lived in Brunswick. He was just jogging in the white section of Brunswick, but the same thing with Michael Brown and Ferguson. A lot of Black people are being pushed into the suburbs, which are now becoming more affordable because of all the gentrification that's happening in the city. But those places have less tolerance and more aggression to the presence of Black people. Plus, they don't have the infrastructure. They don't have the public transportation infrastructure or the education infrastructure. So it's a much more dicey environment to be in. And so you see a lot more, like, I don't know if you heard about this story in the United States, Kenosha, where there's a black man who was shot 7 times by the police officer. He lived, but then there was a sort of an uprising, and then this guy Rittenhouse comes in and kills 2 people, another one. But the issue is that there's Black people moving into new communities, or there's an expansion of Black people in different types of communities where Black people weren't in before because those communities are affordable, and then there's tension that happens there. So the issue is, where are the First Nation people moving to, and is the infrastructure there to welcome them, sustain them? Is it affordable? What happens when they move into those communities? How are they treated? How are they not treated? How are they harassed? Or is it accepting? What are they moving into? And I think that's been my big experience, trying to figure out how to deal with that, how to manage that, how to articulate that gentrification is pushing people out. And then instead of being in a city that's sort of majority, you may end up on a block or a half a block or 3/4 of a block or three blocks, but you're in a smaller community and you may just feel the pressure more.
But you spend quite a bit of time as an activist, but gathering and making sure voices are heard and ensuring those voices are heard. Do you have any pointers in that direction?
Yes, I mean, the reason I mentioned the part about the 7 times of the budget deficit, the change in the budget, because I saw it. I was deputy mayor of the state, and I was deputy mayor and the director, so I have a political title as deputy mayor, but I also ran the department. And we would be in these budget meetings, and I would just see what the police were doing, and it's not a comparable in the sense because there's a police job and there's an economic development job, but it impacts staffing and impact the level of expertise. It impacted the amount of resources we're able to do to support projects. I feel like there's all types of communities. There's communities that need to be stabilized, that are in transition, that need some level of balance in terms of affordability. And we couldn't really do it because we didn't have the resources. So, but for the private sector, we weren't even able to do it. And even in the context of having just left the GSD at that point in time, I was able to call back to Harvard and have them bring students down to help me do work. But it was, I had to rely on some sort of personal resourcefulness that I do think a lot of, planners, especially more seasoned planners and architects and administrators and placemakers, they have, but it was outside the frame. So these movements to really develop more balanced budgets in municipal and state government are important because you need money. You need resources to be able to do it. And what ends up happening, especially when, the land has been stolen and the people work for free. And so, there's never been a point where people have been caught up. There's never been a point where it's been on equal footing. So there's always been a level of resistance and to the notion that their government involvement is important to provide people with the resources to get ahead. But resources were there. Like I said, it was 7 times as much. And the reason in the overtime budget, so we used to submit our budgets, but the overtime budget was that wasn't even a budget. So you submit a budget, say the budget was $200 million or $100 million. And then you had, $40 million of overtime. That wasn't your budget. That was overtime budget that you had to ask for additional money. So, they submit one budget, then they have $40 million overtime budget. And it was just something that was, it was consistent, so the budget actually takes into consideration that it'd be police overtime. And so trying to restructure the society and the municipal and private resources to provide more resources into the community is key. Because if it's not about money, then what is it about?
Wow. Okay. So we had some questions that were pre-submitted by people who knew were going to speak Baye. And this one is from Sylvia, who's an alumna. I am shocked by the images of an extent of homelessness in the USA. Is it possible to end homelessness in the USA?
Yeah, is it possible? Yes. Is the will there? No. I mean, the will. I mean, that's what's happened is, and this is really the homelessness, I think, increases are really direct response to gentrification. There's always a level of homelessness, but what ends up happening is that a lot of cities do have some level of infrastructure in terms of social services. And there's also the issue around safety and accessibility and public transportation. So you see them in urban areas. But then if you can't afford to have a home there, you still need access to those resources. It's really, it's rural poor and urban poor are different, and in the United States. And so what I'm seeing is that in cities that have a substantial amount of gentrification, a substantial amount of homelessness. And
Right.
that's where I'm seeing that. So you see places like Seattle, San Francisco, New York, DC, cities that have really been substantially gentrified. That's where there's a huge homeless population. And those people, probably people who live there. Now, there's another part of it that's happening, at least I've heard in Seattle and other places, that people from other places come there because they do have resources and they do have an infrastructure. But it's really in the places that have the most gentrification that you see a substantial amount of homelessness. And like I said, the resources are there, but the priority and the will, the political will is not. And I think that's, of all the things I learned in city government, is maybe the most important thing I learned is there the political will to get it done.
Ain't that the truth across the world? Baye, I've got one final question for you. There will be those watching this who are thinking, I want to have the impact that you've had. What advice do you have for them?
Listen to your Professor David Sanderson. That's it.
I wouldn't go that
That's not gonna work. No, school was important for me. I have to admit, it was. It's like I said, my grandparents were sharecroppers. My mother didn't graduate from high school. I went to school, and I went. I didn't stop. I mean, I did. I sort of went straight through. So I went from the army to college, grad school. So I sort of went straight through because I always felt if I would stop, I wouldn't start back. But the education was important to me. I mean, maybe it's how I grew up in the United States and the type of community I grew up in. But the educational point was important because it gave me the flexibility. It gave me the longitude and latitude to be able to do the work that I wanted to do when I wanted to make the shift. And I'm thankful for that because I do know that having it's also having the type of education that I have also gives me the confidence to make leaps that other people may not have. So it's both.
Wow, that's really powerful. And it strikes me that your ability to reinvent and to challenge and not be happy with the status quo and to get on with it in a practical way are things we can all learn from.
Yeah, I'm learning every day. This is interesting being home because I'm with people I've known for 40 years, and so that part of it has been significant. That you're really familiar with people and really familiar with the community, and so that's been different. I'm not the same person, so that's also been a challenge for a lot of people. But it's been, and I don't live too far away. The town I live in is a couple of towns away from where I grew up. So I'm actually only 15 minutes from where I grew up at. So being able to take these skills and then use them in a place that in a lot of ways looks and feels the same, which is a tragedy. That doesn't look like there's been a lot of economic development activity in Patterson in the last 30 years. And so I'm thankful that I'm able to provide some support, but there's a lot of work that needs to get done. And that's the other thing too. I think that there's just a lot of work that needs to be done everywhere. So I don't think that that's the challenge. It's really finding the resources and the team and to human, physical, social resources to get the work done.
I think that's a perfect phrase to end on. Baye Adofo-Wilson, a total privilege to have you present this year's Judith Neilson UTZON lecture. We would have loved to have had you in person. I hope we can in the future. I think everyone watching this will be moved, but also hopefully moved also and challenged to act. So Baye, thank you very much indeed. And thank you all for watching.
Thank you.